Magandang hapon mga teachers. Welcome to our fourth synchronous session. Ako nga pala si Louie Cagasan, isang research officer sa Assessment Curriculum and Technology Research Center or ACRC. ACRC is a partnership between two universities, the University of the Philippines and the University of Melbourne. Right now, we are under UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies or UPCIDS in UP Diliman. Ako ay isa sa inyong host hapon to. Magandang hapon sa iyo, Laling.
Magandang hapon din sa iyo, Louie. I'm Elaine Baggy, also one of the research officers of ACRC at ang mga kasama po ni Louie bilang host ngayong hapon. We want to acknowledge the Sustaining Education Reform Gains or SURGE project implemented by Save the Children Philippines and all our attendees for today's synchronous sessions. Nakasubaybay sa atin ngayon ang ating mga guro mula sa regions 5, 6, 8, at 10. Again, welcome everyone to our fourth synchronous session. Ano ba ang meron sa session natin ngayong hapon, Louie?
Sa hapong ito, pag-uusapan natin ang paksang tinalakay sa Synchronous Session 4. Ito ay ang interpretation and use of student data during classroom discussion. Our research speakers will help us go through the highlights of Session 4 and later on address the questions raised from the reflection logs and from the YouTube comments. We will also be presenting some more examples. Kung sa synchronous sessions, ang example natin ay pang high school, sa synchronous sessions natin ngayon, pang elementary naman. I'm sure we're all excited to listen to them, but before we get to business, let us first listen to a short message from the Australian Ambassador to the Philippines, His Excellency Stephen J. Robinson.
Good day to all of you, our fine teachers. It is a privilege to speak to you today and commend you for being part of this online professional development opportunity. Your work is so important to the future of your country because education is key. It is one of the foundations of society. And how well you educate children will have an impact on the future of this country. Australia has been involved with the education sector in the Philippines for several decades now because we want to see a strong, prosperous, educated Philippines. I am pleased that Australia supports DepEd on teacher professional development and curriculum enhancement through partners like Assessment, Curriculum and Technology Research Centre or ACT-RC, an organisation born from Filipino-Australian collaboration and shared expertise. I hope you find this training delivered by ACT-RC in collaboration with the Department of Education's National Educators Academy of the Philippines useful in further developing the reading, math and science literacy of your students. As you are aware, this training is part of a series of professional development activities on student learning assessments and emerging literacies. It is closely aligned with the focus of the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, which the Philippines participated in for the first time in 2018. I am glad to note that this program aims to support you in responding to the evolving needs of your students for relevant and updated knowledge and skills, an area of particular interest to Australia. I would like to briefly acknowledge ACT-RC, specialists from the University of the Philippines and the University of Melbourne. Education remains a core priority for Australia's development cooperation with the Philippines. Our partnership in education has gone from strength to strength over the last 3 decades. Australia and the Philippines are also long-standing partners. Last year, in 2021, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the diplomatic relationship between Australia and the Philippines. On a personal level, let me share with you that supporting teachers is something very close to my heart. I was a teacher myself, and so were several of the staff members at the embassy before we pursued careers in diplomacy. So, I am intimately familiar with some of the challenges of your work and the importance of what you do. The pandemic has made your jobs much more challenging, and we appreciate your continued perseverance, innovation, and resilience in facilitating learning for millions of Filipino children across different modalities. Our children's education right now is one of the most important investments we have for the future. Education is a fundamental aspect of development, both to an individual and to a society. Australia, as a reliable friend and a good neighbour to the Philippines, will support you in whatever way we can. In closing, I would like to leave you with a line from Joseph Joubert. To teach is to learn twice. I hope you will not get tired of teaching, because that also means you will continue to learn. So thank you for your love of learning. I wish you all the very best as you continue with your quest for education quality through these trainings. Congratulations to all of you. Mabuhay.
Thank you, Ambassador Robinson. At this point, you would request the participants to use the comment section only to raise questions regarding the presentation. While our resource speaker is delivering her presentation, feel free to type in your questions or comments in the comments box. They will be answered later in the session. To present to us the highlights of session 4, we have with us our resource speaker for today, Dr. Marlene Ferrido. Dr. Marlene Ferrido is a Philippine Deputy Director of ACT-RC. Some of her involvements in the center include the research on the progress of students through the science curriculum review of the Philippine K-12 curriculum, feasibility study on microcertification for the alternative learning system in the Philippines, and technical support in the review of DepEd's reports on international large-scale assessments such as PISA 2018 and TEAMS 2019. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Marlene Ferrido.
Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Ako po ang mag-share ng mga highlights para sa ating session 4. So, mag-share screen ako at re-reviewin natin yung napakinggan nyo sa video at mga sinagutan nyo din. Okay, so the title of our session is Interpretation and Use of Student Data During Classroom Discussion. Now, let me clarify the meaning of student data. These are the pieces of evidence that you have collected from the students with regards to formative and or summative assessments. So they can be answers to assessment tasks, assessment items, answers to activities, and so on. All right. Just for a review, in session 1, you will recall that we shared with you the purposes of assessment. And if you recall also, assessment can be formative or summative or both, depending on the purpose or your purpose in doing such assessment. Note also that a summative assessment can be used for formative assessment if you're going to use the results of the summative assessment to inform your teaching and learning. All right. Now, also in session 2, the focus was on assessment planning, and we shared with you factors to consider with respect to what to assess, and those are curriculum standards, or for example, learning competencies, curriculum connections, progression of learning, and timing of the assessment. And in terms of how to assess, we shared with you how to select assessment methods, primarily considering the context and how to design the task. Now, last week, we had session 3, evidence collection. And if you will recall, we talked about the progression of learning, which is a sequence of topics and competencies drawn from the curriculum guide. It shows how a particular topic develops from the simplest or the most fundamental concept to the most complex. And we answered 3 questions, like how can a progression of learning help assessment design? The answer for this is to determine what your students know and can do. Secondly, it's also important to consider a student's zone of proximal development when we assess learning, so that you as teachers can find out what concepts and skills your students need or need help with by determining the zone of proximal development. And we will learn more about this in session 4. Now, the session last week also concluded with regards to the benefit of creating tasks and writing assessment items for different levels of student competence. And this is to ensure that all types of learners in the class are learning. All right. Another review is that if you recall, in the first session, we noted the 2 different types of formative assessment: informal formative assessment and formal formative assessment. Also in session 2, we shared with you the different assessment cycles that can be done in the teaching learning process, from the shortest, which is a minute by minute within lesson assessment, to the short cycle, which is day by day. So that will be in between lessons. The medium cycle, which is within and between instructional units or chapters, and the long cycle, which is across the quarter, the semester, or the school year. Okay. And our focus for today is how do you do a short cycle within lesson informal formative assessment through class discussion. All right. Now, this must already be a very familiar diagram to you. Here, you will find that after planning for assessment, in the teaching learning process, you have the 3 different processes: evidence collection, evidence interpretation, and evidence use. Now, also at the side, you see here the different cycles which I just have mentioned. Please note that these cycles are framed within the formative assessment process. So, when you collect evidence, you interpret evidence and use these pieces of evidence, they are within the span of each of these cycles. So you do these 3 processes, whether it's short, it's medium, or a long cycle. All right, so now let's go to the essential questions that we need to answer for session 4. The first is, how can teachers identify the current level of student understanding? Paano nyo ba malalaman kung ano talaga yung level ng mga estudyante nyo? What information do you need? Okay. Secondly, why is there a need to process student responses or data during the class discussion? So ayan, kailangan pinoprocess nyo sa isip nyo o pinoprocess nyo rin together with your students kung ano ba yung mga sagot nila at ginawa nila dun sa assessment task. Now, bakit kailangan yon? So, sasagutin natin yan ngayon. And thirdly, how can you use classroom discussion to bridge learning gaps? So, mahalagang mag-classroom discussion because you will make the gap smaller or get rid of the learning gaps as you discuss with your students. Okay. Now, let me go now to the informal formative assessment or assessment conversations. Here, ano ba ibig sabihin natin ng informal? Now, an informal formative assessment happens through conversations. In other words, the teacher talks with the students and the students respond. And these are also informal activities that the students can do within a short time during the period. Now, when we say informal formative assessment, that also means data collection or responses, collection of responses, and on-the-spot modification or instruction needed based on the collected data or responses or evidence. Okay, so talagang on the spot kasi within the class period nyo to gagawin. Now, there is a model developed by Ruiz Primo and Fortak in 2007 called the SRU model, which shows you or depicts informal formative assessment. So first, the teacher elicits the responses from the students. The student responds, of course, to the teacher. Next is the teacher recognizes the student response, and then the teacher uses the student response. Saan niya ginagamit ito? Whatever information, response, or answer the teacher gets is collected to modify or adjust teaching strategies. Kaya nga on the spot. Pag nakita nyo na may misconception or hindi naiintindihan based on their answers to the different tasks, then you have to use that information and adjust your teaching. So kahit may lesson plan kayo, you should be flexible to adjust what is there in your lesson plan to address the need of the student. All right, so now, itong picture na to is the ESRU or the ESRU model in action. If you will recall, the grade 2 English lesson using the story of Archibald, okay, is the context here. So first, the teacher elicits student response. So anong ginamit niya to elicit that response? Nagtanong siya, is the story of Archibald a fiction or non-fiction? Ayan. So typically, the students will respond to the question. Meron dyan fiction, non-fiction, non-fiction, fiction, fiction, non-fiction, fiction. So, iba-iba ang responses ng estudyante. So, anong gagawin ni teacher? Iisipin niya, so nandito sa bubble, ang iniisip niya, it seems that some of my students are having trouble differentiating non-fiction from a fiction story. Yun ang naiisip niya. So, she is recognizing the student responses, that there are differences. So, ano namang ginawa niya ngayon? Sabi niya, should I give a lecture about it? Or should I ask their peers to help them differentiate non-fiction from fiction? Alright? So, meron siyang, ako ba ang magle-lecture? Should I give them an activity? So, teacher pa rin yan. What kind of feedback should I give them? Teacher pa rin. Pero itong isa, should I ask their peers? Magtatanong siya sa mga classmates. Okay? So, Anong susunod? Now, this one now is interpretation or reflecting the student's responses. Okay. Now, going back to the model, so nakita nyo, yung E, elicits, yung S, student response, yung R, the teacher recognizes in her mind the responses, and U, the teacher uses the student responses. Okay, now, ang unang tanong natin, yung essential question. How do we identify the student's current level of understanding? Kasi dun sa nag-answer na 7, parang halos patas lang in terms of percentage kung fiction or non-fiction yung story ni Archibald. Alright, so the first process that you need do is have a clear understanding of the progression of learning. You remember that in the story of Archibald, the teacher last week had several levels of proficiency in the progression of learning. Okay? So that's 1. Kailangan alam nyo yung progression of learning. 2. Elicit evidence about students' understanding. So you have to know the level of the student's understanding. What's the evidence? And thirdly, recognize, interpret, or reflect on the student responses, activities using the zone of proximal development. Now, review. Last week also, pinag-usapan natin yung zone of proximal development, di ba? Sabi natin, yung ZPD or zone of proximal development is the distance between what the student can do independently and what he can do with the help or guidance from a teacher or from a more capable peer or classmate. Okay? So yun yung point na kayang gawin ng estudyante yung task with assistance. Alright? Hindi niya kayang gawin independently. Pag kaya niyang gawin independently, he is at the zone of actual development. Pag-aralan natin yan last week. Alright, so, for example, your current lesson is on the Archibald story. And then, you can put the progression in such a way that the level can determine whether the student can do the task independently. So that's zone of actual development. Whether the student can do it with guidance or assistance, that is CPD. And beyond CPD, what the student cannot do even with guidance. Okay? Now, recall the lesson in math. Ba? Dun sa lesson in math, yung learning competency 1, yung pinakasimpleng competency, it says, understands the properties of addition, commutative associative identity, and applies each in appropriate and relevant situation. Now, if many of your students can do that independently without any assistance from a classmate or from you, then those groups of students are in ZAD. Now, when you go to the next learning competency, adds mentally 1-digit numbers to 2-digit numbers with sums up to 50 using appropriate strategies. Now, if based on the assessment task, may example tayo last week, di ba? Tungkol dito. Based on the assessment task, the students or many of your students can do the task with guidance, then those students are with CPD. Tapos, yan din, if they can add mentally this 1-digit numbers to 2-digit numbers, and they can do the task independently, then those groups of students are in the ZAD. Okay? Ngayon, meron pa rin manatitirang konti. Talagang hindi nila magagawa yung task sa Learning Competency 1 and 2. So, yan yung kailangan din ng tulong. Okay? Now, in the next lesson, day after, pag ituro nyo na, and the student can do the task LC2, adding mentally 1-digit numbers to 2-digit numbers, walang assistance, then the group of students na nasa ZPD kahapon, nasa ZAD na sila ngayon sa next lesson. And then, you have to give more complex assessment tasks related to Learning Competency 2 and about to reach Learning Competency 3. And if the student can do it with guidance, nasa CPD sila. And may pa konti-konti pa rin maiiwan. They cannot do the task or the math exercises even with guidance. Then, makikita nyo sa next lesson ulit kung hindi pa pala nila nakukuha. Kasi kung hindi, kailangan pa kayong magbigay ng mga drills and examples. And if they can do it with guidance, then they are at the CPD, and that is a good time to assess your students. All right? So yung arrow na yan is more on the learning development of the student. Okay. So yan, kung paano nyo ma-identify yung kanilang level of understanding. Secondly, dun sa diagram, nung nagre-reflect ng teacher in using data or responses of the students during classroom discussions, then she is well, or the teacher is well on her way to bridge learning gaps. All right? And again, in the video, you will recall another definition of formative assessment. It says there that formative assessment is the process of providing information to teachers that will inform their instruction and improve student learning outcomes. So, mahalaga ang FA kasi ini-inform ang teacher kung paano niya ituturo yung mga kailangang i-emphasize dahil hindi pa naintindihan ng mga estudyante or kailangan pa nila ng marami pang exercises. All right. So there are two references in terms of actions in doing formative assessment. Okay. Meron dito, naka-enclose dyan in a red square from the assessment for learning material. It says there, sit, parang elicit naman dun sa Black and William reference. Tapos, reflect upon, iniisip ng teacher, paano ko ba to maituturo ng mabuti at maintindihan ng mga estudyante? And so, she is thinking of different ways of collecting data and also interpreting student responses. And then, ang susunod ay yung respond naman, magre-respond siya doon sa responses ng students or gagamitin niya use doon sa SRU model. Okay? Now, and one of the best ways to be able to respond, to bridge the learning gap is through feedback. Okay? Trumbull and Lash defines feedback or describes feedback this way. Feedback takes on a formative role when it provides information about the gap between a student's current understanding and the desired level of understanding. Okay, so yung feedback ng teacher, will give the information and also feedback from the students. Okay? The purpose of feedback is to reduce the discrepancy or the gap between current understandings and performance and a desired goal. Right? So it's very important. Now, how do we use the student responses or data or pieces of evidence to give feedback? Now, Sadler, as cited by Haiti and Timperley, said that feedback needs to provide information specifically relating to the task or process of learning that fills a gap. Okay? So, dapat may information to fill the gap between what is understood by the student and what is aimed to be understood. Meron kayong learning goal at nakikita niyo yun sa learning competency. Ngayon, kapag yung level ng estudyante ay mababa or malayo pa dun sa goal, now there is a gap. And feedback will provide information so that the gap will be decreased or lessened. Okay? Or filled up completely. All right. Now, in a research by Haiti regarding the ranking of influences or the effect sizes on learning of different factors on learning achievement, and his group studied 240 factors. The first factor which has the highest effect size is classroom discussion. The effect size are the reflected on the numbers here. So 0.82 ang effect size ng classroom discussion. Ang feedback ay 0.7. These are just 10 of the 240 factors to affect that gives effect sizes. Now, also, you will see that ICT is just 0.47, motivation is 0.42, reducing class size na yon ang gusto lagi nating mangyari kasi marami tayong estudyante, has only an effect of 0.21 to learning achievement. Alright? Now, here is a slide to show you aspects of formative assessment from William and Thompson. Makikita nyo dun sa first column yung actors or those that are participating in the teaching learning process, the teacher, the peer, the learner. And then you have the first two questions here. Where is the learner going? And where is the learner right now? Now, these first two questions will show you the importance of the progression of learning. Diba? Kasi, imagine niyo yung staircase, alright? Nasa isang level yung student A, nasa level 2 naman yung student B, but you want them all to go to level D or level 4. Okay? So, how do you let them go through and fill in the gaps? So, kailangan the progression of learning will answer these first two questions. In the second question, where is the learner right now? That really shows the need to identify the zone of proximal development so that you can give the appropriate tasks and activities that will match their level of learning. All right? And then the third question, how do you get there, can be answered by, paano pupunta dun sa desired level? that can be answered by providing feedback. Okay? So here, saan pupunta yung bata or yung estudyante? The teacher needs to clarify and share the learning intentions and criteria for success, which is in the learning competency or the curriculum standard. Now, where is the student right now? The teacher should know how to do effective discussions, tasks, and activities that will give evidence of learning. Okay? Ngayon, a classmate or a peer will be able to understand the learning intentions and criteria for success. So, matutulungan niya yung kaklase niyang nangangailangan nun. And the peer can also activate students as learning resources for one another. Nagtutulungan sila. Okay? Now, for the learner himself, kailangan naman niya maintindihan yung learning intentions. Kung clarify ng teacher, dapat intindihan ng learner. Ngayon, nasaan siya? Dapat alam din niya kung ano na yung skill or concept na naintindihan niya. And he needs to be activated as owners of their own learning. In other words, he feels responsible also for learning the concept or the skill. Okay, now, please take note that the assistance, the guidance, and the feedback of the teacher do not always need to come from the teacher. So, yung assistance pwede sa peers. Kaya merong peer dyan. Hindi lagi-lagi kayo ang mag-a-assist or mag-guide. Kaya mahalaga ang group work at mahalaga na nag-uusap sila sa isa't isa. Now, you saw in the video a model of feedback to enhance learning. Hindi ko na iisa-isahin yung boxes, but take note of the fourth narrow box here, which says each feedback question works at 4 levels. So, in order for you to provide feedback, you have to ask, right? Or you have to do something. And eto may 4 levels. The task level, how well the tasks are understood or performed by the students. The process level, what is the main process needed to understand or perform the tasks required? Okay. The self-regulation level, ano naman ito? Ito naman ay tungkol sa self-monitoring ng estudyante, directing and regulating of actions. At self-level, these are personal evaluations and affect or positive comments about the learner. So, tingnan natin kung anong nature nitong mga feedback levels na to. Okay? In the next slide. So, you have 4 levels of feedback. Yung tinatawag na FT is feedback on the task or product. Anong ibig sabihin nun? This is about your comments or your feedback about the task completed by the student or a product that was done by the student. It's called corrected feedback or knowledge of results. So this feedback is related to how correct, how neat, or a behavior or some other criterion about the task or product. So FT yan. Yun namang FP ay feedback about the processing of the task. Now, this is about what process was used to create the product or complete the task. Ano ba yung proseso na ginamit ng estudyante? So, the feedback is directly aimed at the learning processes required to understand or complete the task. This concerns relations between the environment and the person's or student's perception. Well, the example that I will give you later will clarify these descriptions. Now, the third level is feedback about self-regulation. Now, this one is, activating the students to engage further on the task. Kaya nakalagay dito, greater skill in self-evaluation or confidence to engage further on a task. May iba pa siyang gagawin na mas complex doon sa nauna na niyang nagawang task. And the teacher gives feedback on that. And then fourth feedback is about the person himself. It is directed to the self. Now, many authorities say that this is unrelated to the performance on the task. Okay? It is not very useful in encouraging or in letting the student reach the next level of performance. So ito yung example sa math. Grade 2 math pa rin. It's addition without regrouping. The learning competency is the learner must add numbers with sums through 1,000 without regrouping. Okay. So dito, kapag ang feedback ay feedback on the task, this is called the corrected feedback or knowledge of results and related to correctness and some other criteria. So, example, sabi ng teacher, tiyaking ang lahat ng mga panuto ay naiintindihan at nasusunod. So, ano yan, more on correctness of doing the task. Maging maingat din sa pagkopya mula sa iyong solution box patungo sa susulatan mo ng iyong sagot. You see, it's really on the task itself. Now, what about FP or process of the task? Ano naman feedback to? It's aimed at the learning processes required to understand or complete the task. Iba yan dun sa una. So example, sa pagdaragdag ng mga bilang, di ba addition yung lesson, dapat ay nagsisimula tayo sa pinakamaliit na place value. So that's a very important process. Sa ating halimbawa, 13 idagdag sa 15 sa mga digit na 3 at 5 na nasa ones place, tayo magsisimulang magdagdag. So, sinasabi dyan yung direction on how to add first numbers in the ones place. Diba? Alright. Now, kapag self-regulation ang feedback, that involves a greater skill on the part of the student in self-evaluation or, providing him the confidence to engage further on a task. So halimbawa, sabihin ng teacher, nasisimulan mo nang maintindihan ang proseso ng pagdaragdag or addition. Maaari subukang gamitin ang iba pang mga estratehiya sa pagdaragdag upang mas maintindihan at mas mahasa ang kasanayan. So feedback ito ng teacher na yung estudyante niya, pwede na siya talagang gumawa ng further task. Kasi sinabi niya na simulan mo nang maintindihan ang proseso ng addition. Okay? So, pwede nang subukan ng estudyante ang ibang strategies. Ngayon, syempre, yung teacher, kailangan magbigay ng tasks related to that. Okay? And then, the fourth level or the fourth type is self as the person or FS. So, personal comment ito. na unrelated sa performance. Halimbawa, sabihin ng teacher, mahusay na pagpapaliwanag ng sagot. O di parang commendation, no? Kitang-kita ang husay mo sa matematika. Siyempre maganda to para mag-encourage. Pero hindi yan makakatulong sa bata, sa estudyante at saka sa teacher para umusog sa mas mataas na level of competency. Kailangan mag-comment sa ito, task, process, or at a higher level pa, yung self-regulation. Okay, now, itong 4 na levels of feedback na to ay nakaayos dito sa table na to. From not sufficient going up to the most effective. So, simula tayo sa baba. Yung feedback about self, like, very good, mahusay, kitang-kita ang husay mo, is not sufficient. Well, of course, it is good. It's very encouraging for anyone, even the teacher herself, or for the student. Pero, hindi yan sufisyente. Kailangan umakyat ang feedback ng teacher sa level na feedback about a task or a product. So, kagaya ng sinabi kanina, tiyakin na ang lahat ng mga panuto ay naiintindihan at nasusunod. So, gina-guide talaga yung feedback, parang guidance dito sa level na to. That's useful. Maingat sa pagkopya. O nga naman, ano? So, the next one is an effective level of feedback, which is about the processing of the task. Paano ba pre-process o paano, ano ang pinagdaanan ng estudyante sa paggawa ng task? So, sinabi ng teacher, sa pagdaragdag ng mga bilang, dapat magsimula sa ones place. Yon, importanteng feedback yon. Kasi nare-review din yung concept of addition. And fourthly, yung tungkol naman sa self-regulation na feedback, ito yung pinaka-effective, the most effective. So, sasabihin mo muna, nagsisimula ka ng maintindihan mo yung proseso ng addition or pagdaragdag. Maaring subukang gamitin mo na ang iba pang strategy. So, bibigyan mo pa ng additional examples. Okay? At additional tasks. Tapos, check din kung ayon ay iintindihan na ng estudyante. Okay. So, sa English naman, example to, yung English lesson, yung tungkol kay Archibald naman, ano. Ang learning competency ay verbalizes understanding of the story events before, during, and after reading. So, kapag processing of tasks, these are the 2 most effective levels of feedback, no? Ang sasabihin mo sa processing, that's already a good conclusion. But, maybe, you can relate it more to the story to help us understand how you came about with that idea. Okay? So, nakikita nung estudyante yung proseso na ginawa niya based on your feedback. Pero nagsabi kang, that's a good conclusion. Pero, relate it more to the story. Ano pa ang dapat niyang gawin? Ngayon, yung most effective sa self-regulation, sasabihin mo, good job for being able to remember some of the details correctly. So parang ano yan, personal comment yung una, yung good job. Pero merong pang dinagdag, yung nagbibigay ng feedback. You try to go back again to the details, meaning the details of the story, and see where you made mistakes. Okay? Ibang klaseng feedback yan, Pinapahanap ng teacher kung saan nagkamali yung estudyante. So, the teacher guides the students to regulate himself, meaning to guide himself as to how to correct the errors that have been made. Okay. Pag naman task or product lang, sabihin, Archibald's character profile, this is also useful. would have been more complete if you were able to also include descriptions of his physical appearance. Okay, so you see that this is useful, no? But this is not the more effective. I mean, there are more effective ones yung pinakita ko sa inyo earlier. And of course, yung isang feedback, you have fantastic ideas which enrich our discussion. Of course, nakaka-encourage yan sa estudyante. But this is not sufficient. Okay? So, simply providing more feedback is not the answer. Sabi nga ni Haiti and Timperley. Because it is necessary to consider the nature of the feedback. The timing. O nga naman, baka naman hindi pa natatapos gumawa ng task yung estudyante ay nag-feedback na yung teacher. Right? And how a student receives this feedback. Okay? So, the teacher needs to be very sensitive in terms of the words used in giving feedback so that the response of the student will be better or according to what the feedback is saying, and the student will seek the feedback continuously. All right? So, napakahalaga talaga ang feedback. Hindi pa pwedeng tanungin lang ng teacher, any questions? So, pag walang nagtatanong, all right, tapos na. Kulang na kulang yon. We have not expressed any feedback. Now, in terms of identifying your teacher's current level of formative assessment practice, the video, I'll just go through this quickly. The video showed you research done by ACRC and University of Melbourne, just to explore some ways of capturing the teacher's formative assessment behaviors in Philippine classrooms using an observation tool. And of course, it was focused on the eliciting part and the using part components of the SRU model. Now, just to fast track, ito yung nakitang 4 levels of formative assessment practice. Sa level 1, the teacher only attends to the planned lesson delivery. Kung ano yung nasa lesson plan, tinuro niya. Sa level 2 naman, the teacher acknowledges discrepancies between the intended lesson and student responses. So, nagpo-provide siya ng additional information to the students and at times directions to complete the task. Sa level 3, the teacher responds to the progress of the student. Ngayon, nag-a-adjust na siya ng teaching strategies and provides feedback about processes and conceptual understanding to address, identify discrepancy between the intended lesson and the student responses. And the highest level is that the teacher teaches students how to become evaluators of their own learning processes. Okay? Now, sana ang aspiration nyo ay pumunta sa mas mataas na level na pinagsisimulan nyo. Alright? Mula sa pinagsisimulan nyo. So, halimbawa, if a student gives an incorrect response, paano mo malalaman kung anong level ng formative assessment practice meron ka sa teacher? Kapag nasa level 1 ka, sasabihin mo sa estudyante, the answer is incorrect, the response is incorrect, and then you will give the details related to the problem, uulitin mo kung ano bang hinahanap nung task or nung problem, and then you call another student to answer. Okay? So, kung minsan embarrassing yan, no? Dun sa may incorrect answer. Sa level 2 naman, the teacher calls another student, then reminds the class about the concept behind the task. Sometimes the teacher would try to identify the process used by the student. So level 2 yan. Mas mataas dun sa first level na sinabi lang incorrect. Tapos tumawag ng ibang estudyante. Sa level 3, the teacher probes further to understand the level at which the student is operating and tries to answer the misconceptions. So a small percentage of the teachers observed in the research fell under level 3. And there were rare cases of teachers in level 4, which is the highest level, allowing the students to become evaluators of their own learning. All right. So the last part is interpreting and using student data or responses, answers in distance learning in the Philippines. So during the pandemic and for the past 2 years, tayo ay nagdi-distance learning. And you will see here that how do we apply all the principles that we have learned from this session to a distance learning approach? Well, hopefully you will be going into face-to-face classes already in November. But while you are not yet there, how do you give just-in-time feedback to your students? So you see here the rows, no? Showing different learning modalities on online, modular, radio, or via TV. The columns here are the actors. Who are the participants? Teacher, parents, and peers. Okay. And if you will look at it, first is the online modality. You will see here that the teacher and also the classmates or the peers can give immediate feedback. Kasi online, di ba? Meron chance na maging, and if that's synchronous, may feedback ka agad na mabibigay yung teacher. So it's feasible. Pati yung mga kaklase nila. Of course, the parents. This may not be applicable to parents. So if there's a misconception or a need to assist the student, it can be given online. But in the second row, sa modular, which is very common across the country, it's difficult for the teacher to give feedback. Yung just-in-time feedback kung merong dapat i-correct, i-clarify, or i-correct na misconception. Kasi you will just be able to get the responses of the students in the formative assessment when you receive the module. So it's difficult. Well, the parents may help. It's feasible also. The peers cannot anymore because it's modular. So in the next session, the approach of how to do giving feedback will be discussed in detail. So sa radio and TV, lahat difficult. Difficult to give just-in-time feedback from the teacher, from the peers or classmates. Depende sa kung kasama manood yung parents, but it's also difficult. Okay? So, in summary, this session have answered the questions on how you know where the students are or how you can identify the student's current level of understanding. And secondly, there were ways to reflect upon and use student responses. Various ways were given to you in terms of feedback also. So you don't just collect, you have to interpret the responses. All right. And third point, you have to guide and provide feedback to your students during class discussions. and make sure that this feedback during class discussion is aimed or targeted at reducing the learning gaps or addressing the learning goals for the topic. Okay? So I hope that this session provided you with sufficient information so that you can interpret data or responses from students during classroom discussions. Okay, so I will stop sharing this time. Salamat sa pakikinig at sana ay mas naintindihan nyo yung napanood nyong video sa pamamagitan nitong synchronous session. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Ma'am Marlene. Very informative ang naging discussion. Importante talaga na hindi lang tayo collect ng data sa mga students natin. We have to interpret and use them by providing appropriate feedback or by adjusting the lesson. Dito, masisigurado natin na ang mga tinuturo natin ay swak o akma sa level of understanding ng mga students.
That's right. Now, I believe Dr. Ferrido is ready to answer your questions. We will begin with the questions raised in the forms that you have submitted. But if you have any more questions, we strongly encourage you to type them in the YouTube comments box. This is the perfect time for you to ask questions. So please do not hesitate. Okay, Louis, gusto mong basahin yung una nating tanong?
Sige. So ito yung first question natin. After identifying the level of learning of our student, is it necessary to provide different kind of formative assessment? Ma'am Marlene? Parang wala si Ma'am Marlene Tala. Baka ano.
I'm sorry, naka-mute
Ay,
pala ako.
nakamute. Ayun, yellow ma'am.
Alright. Binasa ko lang ulit yung tanong. Tapos, parang pinoprocess ko yung tanong na yung teacher, alam na niya kung nasaan sa progression of learning yung estudyante. Okay? Kasi identified na niya, sabi. Is it necessary to provide different kinds of formative assessment? Oo, necessary pa rin para naman makita ng teacher kung pwede na, kung nasa zone of proximal development siya. So kung meron siyang task na ibibigay na nangangailangan ng assistance, then that is a clue to the teacher that the students are at the ZPD. Kasi kaya naman nilang gawin, kaya lang may assistance. Ngayon, kung kaya nilang gawin yung task independently, di nasa zone of actual development sila. So, pwedeng magbigay ka ng task, different kind of formative assessment so that you pull them up along the progression of learning. Okay. Naka-ano ba si Teacher Therese? Naka-Zoom?
Yes. I think she is
might want
now
to answer.
Ito. Hello, Teacher Therese.
Magandang hapon. Would you care to repeat that question?
Ay, naka-mute.
Sorry po.
Lou.
So, babasahin ko po ulit ang tanong. After identifying the level of learning of our student, is it necessary to provide different kind of formative assessment?
Oo. I would agree with what Ma'am Marlene had said. When you provide formative assessment activities to students, even if you know where they are in terms of that progression, by giving different activities, then you would find out if, for example, the student has progressed already in the progression. It doesn't mean that just because you know where the student is, that you just make activities for that particular level. Definitely, you will make activities of a higher level to determine now if the students would have progressed. So, again, I agree with what Ma'am Marlene had said. Okay ang maraming formative assessment activities kahit na alam mo na kung nasaan yung estudyante, kung anong level siya.
All right, so thank you, Ma'am Marlene and Dr. Bustos. So before I read the concern from our reflection log entry, again, we encourage our viewers in YouTube to type in any questions that you have right now in the YouTube comments box. So here's the concern. I am aware that I belong to the level 2 of teacher practice informative assessment. However, I find it sometimes difficult to probe deeper to determine one student's ZPD because I have around 40 pupils to attend to. I also get conscious of the time to finish the lesson because we need to cover a lot of competencies.
Okay, let me answer first. This is a common question, a concern, and a predicament of teachers. Una, I'd like to congratulate the teacher who asked this question because she rated herself as level 2 in practice. So I'm sure that she desires to go up to the next level, level 3, and in due time, the highest, level 4. Now, true, it is difficult to probe deeper so that you know the ZPD of your students. Ang isang approach dito na binigay ng nag-develop ng video ay kung halimbawa math yung subject, lalo na sa elementary, marami kayong drill cards na gagamitin. So, kumbaga, meron na kayong different drills or exercises that can be given to different groups of students. Tapos, habang nakagrupo, tapos itataas lang nila yung card dun sa tanong nyo. So, makikita mo na dun sa 40 kung ilan or gaano karami, percentage-wise, yung hindi nila kayang sagutin yung task or yung question. So, magtatanong ka na naman ng iba pa. And so, in time, malalaman mo kung sino yung nangangailangan ng assistance at kung kaya nilang magawa yung task with your assistance, then they are at their CPD. Now, tama din naman yung sinabi mo, I get conscious of the time to finish the lesson. Pero alam mo, teacher, ay kahit na ma-delay ka ng konti dun sa budget of work, kung alam mo na naintindihan ng mga almost, maybe 80-85% of your students have reached the level of, ZPD, then you are well on your way to help them go to the next level. At least aware ka. Okay? And look at the competencies as chunks of related competencies, hindi yung paisa-isa. So, tingnan niyo yung example. Learning competency, anong last week, di ba? Parang may 3 o 4 na learning competencies and you go up the progression of learning. Okay? So, look at it as a chunk or a whole. Kahit na ang pagtuturo nyo ay day by day. Okay, I hope that helps. Teacher Therese, would you like to add some more?
Actually, challenge talaga yon, no? When you have a big class, and then, so how will you find out if they know the answer or not? If they give you the right answer or not? And I go by what Ma'am Marlene had said. Look for activities where students can give the answer at the same time. So that means, for example, if you have a, let's say, a sheet of paper or a tiny board where they can write the answer immediately, especially if it's like a computation problem which they can solve, and then they can put the answer on that paper or on that board and raise that immediately. That's one way of engaging everybody in class. And so definitely the ones who will give you the right answer, they got it already. But those probably who gave you the wrong answer or who just lifted blank boards, then that they are not there yet, that they have not mastered whatever it is you're trying to teach. So look for ways by which you could get group responses using boards. You can even do thumbs up, thumbs down. Like if you ask a concept, if they think it's true, do thumbs up. If they think it's false, do thumbs down. So what you need to do is to really look at each of your students if they are able to give you the correct answer or not. It is good during recitation, especially in discussion, to cover core concepts for which you can, you're talking to one student, but it doesn't mean that just because you're talking to one student that others are not listening. So that conversation with one student, if you do it well and if you do it aloud, others too will profit from the discussion. So it doesn't have to be one-on-one conversation with each one of them during class time. So again, group answers, like giving group responses, and then having common examples, for example, having common examples that you can discuss in class. I'm pretty sure that other students would benefit from that discussion with that single student. Thank you.
Wala na tayong na-receive na questions sa ating YouTube comment section. Tama ba, Lalaine? So, I guess, maraming salamat sa ating resource speakers. We would like to request our resource speakers to provide their final message before we end our fourth synchronous session.
All right. I think it is very important for the teachers to practice the construction of progression of learning. And I have said last week that you can do this as a team during your LAC sessions or whatever sessions you have. And so it will not be too time consuming because doing the progression of learning will help you really identify the current level of understanding of your students. Okay, go back to the video and the handouts to help you do the progression of learning in your classes. In fact, if you already know what grade level you will teach next school year, gawa na rin kayo ng progression of learning based on the core concepts, okay, and make chunks of them. Yung hindi isa-isang learning competency. And then practice reflection when you have your class discussion kasi magpe-face-to-face na naman kayo. So, pwedeng-pwede yan ma-apply. And when you give feedback, remember the 4 levels of feedback that we have shared with you. Because you will carry these principles from session 1, 2, 3, 4 to the next session next week. Okay? So, all the best when you work on formative assessment. Thank you.
Okay, so it is very important that as teachers, we have a good grasp of the subject that we are teaching. When you understand the subject matter that you're teaching, you're able to have longer conversations with our students. Typically, when we have limited information about certain topics, we cannot fully engage with someone in conversation because, again, of the limits of what we know about the topic. And so as teachers, it is very important for us to understand the topics that we are teaching so we are able to engage our students in conversation. That's one. And then we always talk about learning in a progression. And so our students would progress through different steps. No? They have their own progression of learning. We teachers also have our own progression of learning. So today you have learned that it's not enough to say if the student got an answer correct or wrong. We need to go past that. We need to be able to talk about the task. We need to be able to talk about the process and also teach our students self-regulation skills. And so we found, and I was very happy with the example that was given, the question that was posted earlier. So that was an example of a teacher who was reflecting about where she is or he is in a progression. And so I hope that if you think you are in level 1, that after this course, you would find yourself in level 2 or level 3. But know that you, like your students, you are progressing. And so just take heart and continue on with the training program on building basic assessment, building competence. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am Marlene and Teacher Therese. Now, I think it's a good time to address some administrative issues. For the asynchronous sessions, mas maganda po kung ang gamit niyong device ay ang inyong personal computers so you can view the lecture videos and complete the activities more efficiently. A good internet connection is also required. Pwede pa rin naman po kayong gumamit ng tablet or mobile phone, but make sure to have a stable internet connection. Again, most of the technical issues are device or internet connection related. If you need any help, please send us a message to our Facebook group. Any announcements regarding our ongoing training will all be posted there. So we highly advise that you join and visit it regularly.
Bago rin po tayo magtapos, meron po tayong mga munting paalala. Una, Asynchronous Session 5, Interpretation and Use of Student Data Between Lessons will be available starting Tuesday, July 19. Second, Synchronous Session 5 will be held on Friday, July 22, 3 p.m. via YouTube Live. And for those who have not answered or completed sessions 2, 3, and 4, you may still proceed with the training, but note that we highly encourage you to take the sessions in order to maximize your possibilities for learning. So Asynchronous Session 2 will be closed on July 19. Asynchronous Session 3 will be closed on July 26. Asynchronous Session 4 will be closed on August 2. And for updates and for any concerns, you may visit and reach us through the official Facebook community page, ACT-RC Assessment Professional Development.
Dito po nagtatapos ang ika-4 na synchronous session natin. We hope that this has strengthened your learning and inspired you to look forward to the next asynchronous and synchronous sessions. We look forward to seeing you next time.